the cloud. Got it.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening for this panel from St. Francis of Sales in New York. We have three amazing women tonight who have joined us to close out Women's History Month with a discussion about their experiences as women working in Catholic organizations. For those of you who are parishioners at St. Francis de Sales, you know that as a parish, we're very passionate about the idea of church, of being a church with a little c, and particularly the role of the laity and women in church life. Therefore, we're excited to host this discussion and thank each of you for being here, particularly for our panelists to be part of this discussion this evening. So to kick us off, I'll just start with a brief prayer. Loving God, thank you for bringing us here today and bringing these women to us to share their experiences as we expand our discussion and our knowledge about women in the church. Help all of the women who are members of your church grow in their love for you and their ministry of and their ministry. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So to kick us off, I'll introduce each of our panelists, but then I will kind of send it over to each of you to introduce yourselves as well as your current role and a little bit of a description of it. So tonight, our first panelist is Martha Malinsky. She is the Executive Director of the Association of the Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph, where she's worked since 2015. Prior to joining ACSSJ, she spent 10 years at St. Catherine's in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then we have Lisa Friedlander, who has two roles at the moment. She is currently the program lead for the God Squad, which is the teen youth ministry at St. Clement Catholic Church in Chicago. And she purposely led with that when she first spoke to me. So I wanted to do that as well. And she's also the director for special projects for the Renew My Church campaign within the Archdiocese of Chicago. Prior to that, she's held a variety of roles at St. Clement's Parish and started her career in law. And then we also have Anna Patrice Johnson joining us, who is the U.S. Mission Formation Unit Director for the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, based out of Seattle, Washington. She's had a number of positions with Maryknoll over the past 7 years, and prior to her time at Maryknoll was the educational outreach staff of the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center in Seattle. So first, I will maybe send it over to Martha to start our conversation. Just share a little bit about your current role and maybe what inspired you to join a Catholic organization.
Sure, thanks, Colleen. Happy to be with you this evening. As Colleen said, I'm Martha Malinsky. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph. There are 9 colleges across the country, spanning from California all the way to New York. You have one of our campuses in your own kind of backyard there, St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn, and they also have another campus in Long Island. And one just a little bit north in Albany, the College of St. Rose. But we have 7 other campuses across the country, a few in the Midwest, several on the East Coast in Boston, Philadelphia, St. Paul, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Los Angeles. And I got involved in this work because of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I worked for several years, as Colleen mentioned, at St. Catherine University. I worked as the director of community work and learning, which does a lot of experiential education with students, both through internships, service learning, as well as research, undergraduate research programs. And through that, worked a lot with the ministries of the Sisters of St. Joseph, was very inspired by their commitment, their passion, and work around social justice. and found that when this position came open as executive director of the association, was very drawn to that work because of that passion that the Sisters of St. Joseph bring into their work, but also because of the organizational challenges that the association has. So I love collaboration. I worked a lot, with students and higher education, collaborating with the community and making meaningful learning experiences. I still do some of that, but it's also, my work now is much more about collaboration across the campuses. So how can we be stronger together in this higher education landscape where more and more of our smaller private universities, especially within Catholic higher education, are feeling the crunch of lower enrollments, students wanting all kinds of different experiences in their college experience. And colleges, I think, can do more together. And so that's what our organization, our association tries to do. And so leveraging the resources across our universities and colleges, and also amplifying the work, the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph. So as we have so many Sisters of St. Joseph no longer working on our campuses, our work is really about how do we continue that legacy and the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph on our colleges and universities. So that's a little bit about me and the organization that I work for.
Great. Thank you for that. Lisa, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, before I start, Martha, I just need to give you a big thank you. I have a senior in high school looking to attend a Catholic college. So what you are doing is near and dear to my heart. I'm Lisa Friedlander, and I have had a variety of roles. My current role is with the Archdiocese of Chicago, and I am the program director for a test lab, we like to call it. It's called the Faith Hub, and it's where we test new programs, new ways of doing church, still within the confines of our beautiful liturgy, new ways of hospitality. And since it sits outside of a parish, it isn't bogged down by some of the red tape current programming going on at parishes. So we try new things, we perfect them as much as we can, and then we invite people to come in and try them. And if they like them, take what we've done and take it back to their parishes. So it's a way of helping with the renewal effort in Chicago outside of a parish setting with the intent of raising up leaders and sending them back into their parishes. That's one of my roles. The other is the youth group at my home parish. And it ties in very nicely to renewal because the youth are vital to the renewal of our church. So they go hand in hand, and I do love the teenagers dearly. I got into the role because I practiced law for over a decade and then decided when my youngest child was born to stay home full time. And then when she went to school full time, my husband said, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, well, I love the law, but I'd never see our children if I went back to it. So I went and asked our pastor at the place that I loved, our church, for a job. And I'd been volunteering there for many, many years. And he said, if something comes up, I'll let you know. And it did. And the rest is history. And I've had a lot of different roles at the church, but the youth group has been constant. And now this newer role with the Archdiocese. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Anna, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me tonight. It's a joy to be with you all. So my name's Anna Johnson, and I am the Director for U.S. Mission Formation for the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers. So coming from a very different side of it as well, thinking about how I work for a men's religious order. So my work is largely in helping mobilize the U.S. Church towards a idea of mission and global solidarity. Maryknoll has missions across the world. We've been living in the margins of the margins for over 100 years. And as we've lived in those places, we have seen that the majority of the injustices that the people we are living and working with are facing are due to US action or inaction with our political proceedings and the ways that we engage with the world. And so that's a lot of my job, is helping the U.S. church grow in a sense of when we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, it doesn't just mean the person who lives next door, but it is the person who, grew my coffee that I drank this morning and who made this shirt that I'm wearing as well. So that involves a lot of, particularly for me, I work with educational resources for middle schoolers. So Lisa, I work with the Archdiocese of Chicago a lot around our Missionary Discipleship Institute, and as well with young adults, so people in their 20s and 30s around engaging in this process. And oh yeah, how I got to be working in the church. So coming out of college and university, peace and justice was really what my heart was after. And as I sort of surveyed the field and looked at what was out there, as well as, who would hire me, it tended to be in largely church world. So as many challenges that the church also has around the world, Catholics tend to be responding. I mean, the statistic is that Catholics respond to natural disasters half an hour faster than even the Red Cross, because we're living in community, we're there doing the work, and that there just is a deep sense of justice in our gospels that moves and motivates me, and is a beautiful community to work with, just really incredible, passionate people.
Thank you. A very wide array of impressive careers and vocations within ministry. So I think to start off our broader conversation, and we can pass it among each of you for answers, or piggyback off of one another's responses. I would love to hear some thoughts on maybe how the role of women has evolved in your either time with your organization, in your time with your organizations, and you see it evolving in the future.
Okay, I'm jumping in. I will say in the Archdiocese of Chicago, we have been extremely blessed in that the time that I've been a part of it, the COO of the Archdiocese of Chicago is a laywoman. So she, she has a ton of decision making. She is, step in step, always talking with the cardinal and making decisions on the future of our church. So they really run the church together. Obviously, he is our pastoral leader, but he relies on her heavily. And I think that's enormous and really awesome. And the other is Catholic Charities in Chicago just named their first lay woman as well. I think it's a great sign that we have so much to offer and different perspectives on things, and the church is really embracing that. And we are all God's children, and we all have something to offer. And I think it's great to see those women in leadership roles. And it has happened since I've joined the Archdiocese.
I can jump in as well. I think perhaps my tenure is the shortest on this panel, but just thinking back over even the 10 years that I've been working in church ministry, the opportunities, as Lisa said, for leadership have definitely grown. And I remember a really pivotal moment for us was when the Obama staffers came out with just a conversation. It was a really interesting article, and I don't know if anybody else read it or was interested in it, but they talked about how even when they sat on his President Obama's staff, that they found that they were being mansplained, and they found that they were getting talked over and ignored and that sort of a thing, all the things that we hear about women working really anywhere. And so what they did is they made a pact with each other that they would reference each other. So, sitting there and saying I'm sitting at the table, and as Colleen said earlier in this conversation, that sort of a thing. So when that came out, a bunch of the women that I work with in ministry across different organizations and the Archdiocese out here, we came together and we said, why are we not doing the same thing? And so we've been doing that for, 6-7 years at this point. And it has been amazing to see just how that has snowballed, and then women start to get more speaking opportunities, and then it becomes bigger and bigger. So I think that the ways that we can learn from the corporate world as well and implement them, as well as women being hired to higher roles as well, has been pretty amazing to be witness to.
Yeah, I think I've been in this role for 7 years. And when I think about how higher education is changing, specifically Catholic higher education. It's really quite dramatic. When I think about the presidents who I work very closely with, you know, many of our positions were religious women, Sisters of St. Joseph or other sisters. When I first started this role, there was two sisters that were presidents. Now we have our last Sister of St. Joseph, who is retiring after 30 years. That institution, Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, this will be the first transition to lay leadership, which is huge for that institution, but also huge on our board, where we'll now have all lay leadership. And what does that mean? Some of them come from, Jesuit institutions, which we have a close affinity with, other Catholic institutions. But the role of cultivating that lay leadership is really important. And so I think that's one change. And I also see that change in lay leadership within the charism groups. When I'm, meeting with my colleagues of similar organization, the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, or Franciscan, Benedictine, I was one of the few lay leaders in that group. And now I think we're just a little over half. So that real transition to lay leadership is really important within Catholic higher education. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how does that impact Catholic higher education as a whole, but also just overall. The institutions have a huge role to serve in their communities, and what impact does that make on the local and broader community as well?
Great, thank you for those thoughtful responses. And I think Martha, to piggyback on one of your points, and Annalise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. We talked a little bit about how we're seeing a change in who the leadership is, and particularly lay people in general, and particularly women coming into these roles. Do you have, as we think about, I know we're still kind of looking at the impact of those changes, but are there changes that you're already seeing, or differences in approach with maybe the more diversity of voices that are coming to the table within these institutions, particularly in those leadership positions?
Yeah, honestly, I think that's a very new conversation that's happening. Sort of, what does that look like, structurally? Because it's not just about having individuals in those positions, but how is the institution set up to support that lay leadership, or that new transition into lay leadership? Structurally. So I think the same things around sexism that are, very apparent in the broader society that, Anna, you talked about with the Obama administration. I see that, we have 5 women presidents in our association and 4 are male. That will change next year. The balance will go back to majority male. Our 2 of our campuses just hired male leaders. And, when I talk to the women presidents and other higher education leaders, vice presidents, sexism is very pervasive at the top and continues to be. So we have to think about new dynamics, new ways of lifting up those voices. And also, I would say, the challenge of lifting up diverse voices, about how are we being inclusive of those that have also been traditionally marginalized? Black, Latina, Indigenous, Asian voices within our higher education system, but also as a community as large. So how do we really both lift up individual voices, but also create some structural change to really make those voices valuable and important, and also maybe create new ways of doing things as well?
I will say there are many a meeting in the Archdiocese that remind me of practicing law because I'm the only woman in the room again. They're older and all dressed alike in the Catholic Church, but besides that, I could be standing in front of a room full of partners. So my law background really helped me prepare for that. But I will also say, I came to the church not on the church work, not my faith, but the work, a very odd path. So I don't have a theology degree. I don't have any religious schooling other than attending Catholic schools. I just have a law degree. And so I'm not there to discuss theology or argue it with you or anything about our doctrines. I'm there about community and radical hospitality and moving people towards Jesus in a deeper relationship. And so I think that puts the priests that I'm presenting to or engaging in conversation with sort of at ease. They are theologians or scripture scholars or liturgists. I am none of those things, and I don't pretend to be. And so I'm going to talk to you about this topic that I'm passionate about. And it puts them at ease. And they tend to listen more because I think because I'm not trying to argue with anything that they are experts in, if that makes sense. I don't have experience in being, trying to be a female theologian in a room full of priests. I don't know what that would be like, but I think because I'm coming with this different topic, it makes it easier.
That's really interesting to hear, Lisa, and I definitely can understand that. That's an interesting perspective just to think about. Similarly, there are, I would say the majority of rooms I sit in are all male except for myself and all clerical except for myself. And so it's an interesting intersectional space to be holding, I would say, being a layperson, being a woman, and quite honestly, being often the youngest person on the call as well. And so thinking about how do I decipher my own identity out of that? And like, am I receiving one or the other, or just like a complex mix of all three of those overlaps? I'm never quite sure, but thinking about how it's changed, to your previous question, Colleen, about how it's changed perhaps as well, is I have noticed that, I'm sorry for that, I have noticed that there are more women who are willing to kind of take people under their wing. So the times that I do sit in a room where there are other women, I have felt a different kindredship with them, where we support each other and are willing to back each other up or help each other out in navigating the dynamics of being in a room of tending to be clerical men. So I've been really appreciative of that as more women have gotten into those roles and opening some of those doors.
Yeah, and I think, Anna, actually all of you probably have touched on this a little bit, but curious to hear, as you're sitting in those rooms, we've talked about the sexism, about, but are there other challenges that you see either in those conversations or just in, as Martha mentioned earlier, creating a structure or a church work environment that is open to women in particular, and particularly lay women?
I can jump right. I think this doesn't happen in every room I'm sitting in, and I appreciate working for an order that tends to be, it's a missionary order, so it tends to be on the front of social justice. So, but there are spaces, I think, where the biggest challenge comes is where it's sort of what we refer to as a scarcity mindset, where there's an idea of there's not enough. And so having me as a woman in the room can be challenging to thinking like, are we going to have enough? Am I special or otherwise? And so when the scarcity mindset starts to take over, that's when the greater challenges, I think, arise, when there's challenges that way. Similarly, I'm walking into a new space right now. I'm currently pregnant, and that is a new thing for working for a religious order of men, where my position has only ever been held by a priest. So talking about the structural changes that you named, Colleen, yes, there are huge structural changes that we are wading through at this point, trying to figure out how to unwrap all of that.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that that's very real. And Lisa, I heard that you entered into this work as part-time balancing a family. I am also part-time balancing a family and family obligations. I'm the first lay person in this role. A Sister of St. Joseph had the role for many years. So when I came in thinking about how do we pay somebody, what does that look like? Even, and certainly, benefits. What does that look like? What is needed for somebody that's not a Sister of St. Joseph was very different. And I also think that, Anna, to your point, I'm often the youngest person in the room as well. And what is expected or needed or wanted as a younger professional, although I'm middle-aged now. And so even though that's young by most of the rooms that I sit in, I think that there's a different dynamic about how to really support women in these roles and, balance that, balancing family, and, what does being fully present look like? That looked very different when there was religious sisters in roles or quite honestly, men that have other spouses that balance a lot of the work at home in leadership roles. So it looks different for women. And I think we don't talk a lot about it. We don't talk enough about it. And how that also shapes how we enter into the work environment too. I think back to, a year and a half ago when I had young children at home and, my work is very virtual, always has been. I use Zoom as everyday occurrence, have for the last 7 years. But what did it look like when I had 2 kids at home and I was expected to both be a teacher as well as a professional? So I think we've got some ways to go in terms of really figuring it out, how to embrace both lay voices, but also women and variety of needs, whether they're working moms or single or whatever that looks like.
I will also say there's a lot of hope out there. So I have been blessed to work for some of the best men I've ever known. And I will never forget when my youngest was little, she had to come with me one Sunday to work and we're in my office and she spilled like, I don't know, something all over the carpet. I shut the door, I'm like mopping it up and she's hooting and hollering. I don't even know what she was doing. And my pastor opens the door and I was like, hey. And instead of shutting the door and walking away, he comes in, he picks up my daughter, he sits down and like is chatting with her so I can collect myself. And the whole meeting we had, she was sitting on his lap, like entertaining herself, playing with his glasses or something. And it didn't faze him. It didn't anger him. I think it actually made him happy to sit there and spend some time with the little one. And we carried on with what we needed to talk about and we moved on. Like never once was it a problem. So I think there's definitely hope. I think, I think he appreciated the value I was adding. And if it meant spending 15 minutes playing with my daughter, so be it. So I think there's hope for sure.
Lisa, I think that's such a wonderful story but an interesting point too, because it makes you think, and this will go into my next question about what you think parishes could do better, or the church can do better as a whole, that there's something unique about the church, that it's always been probably more dynamic than your traditional, say, business setting, right? Where you went into the office and it was only adults. Like churches were built around schools and institutions that were meant to care for entire families. So there's a lot of space to be very family friendly in those. So with that, I think I'll go my next question in the vein of hope. So what do we think the church can start doing to do better to support kind of the role of women and promote their contributions throughout ministry?
So one of the programs that the Faith Hub, that's at experimental lab of the Archdiocese of Chicago is promoting is, it's called the Lydia Institute, and it is a spirituality group for professional women. So the woman who started it did her doctoral thesis on the concept that professional women have so much to give, obviously in their professional lives, and they're giving so much in their home lives. What are we as a church giving them so that they can foster and grow their spiritual life? Because obviously they've got work, they've got home, they're running in a million directions, and they're such an asset to the world at large. How can we foster their spirituality? So this pilot program, woman came to me and said, do you know 30 women we could invite and try this? And we did. This was 2 falls ago, and we're now at like 160 women. And it's growing by leaps and bounds. It's forming small group community for these professional women where they can talk about how do you live out your faith in your workplace as the CEO, as a school teacher, as whatever, and giving support for each other. And the fact that the Archdiocese saw a need and supported that, and then the fact that the women took them up on that offer and saw the beauty in this program, I think is a sign of hope. And I think it's something we need to continue to do. Foster a place for our professional women to grow in their spirituality and be fed so they can then go out and do all the great things they're doing in the world.
I can just echo right off of that, Lisa. There's a group that we formed, I think, like 6 years ago, and we call ourselves the Women of Valor, but it's just women who are in different leadership roles across the church in this archdiocese. And we have had we started as like a networking group where we talked about what our roles were and how we could support each other in the work. And it really has moved into like a faith support group in many ways, where we can talk about our work challenges, but then also talk about our home challenges. And I think that the challenges you're naming and the hope you're naming around, like, what does an integration of family and work life look like when somebody works in the church? I think that can start to grow only through having conversations and saying, what's similar, what's different amongst ourselves, and how do we support each other? As I thought about this question as well, Colleen, thinking about, there are a lot of women who work for the church, and I will also name it's a lot of white women who work for the church. And so it's not a fully accessible role, I don't think, for folks who don't have some level of privilege like I do, I think, at some point, because there is also this expectation for full-time women, and I think also part-time women, Lisa and Martha, you both could say this, like evening work, weekend work, often working more than 40 hours a week, or whatever is the number of hours that you're allotted to, because it's part of what we believe in, right? And it's like, I'm not just working for a paycheck, we're fighting for justice, right? And so thinking about how to set up systems and structures within the church to be more family friendly, be a little bit more flexible around work-life balance, be a little more flexible around time on versus time off and what that looks like, which I think can happen through these conversations. And I think a lot of those barriers have started to be crossed during COVID as people have tried to figure out what does work from home while kids are home from school or whatever look like as well. And I think as the church is willing to operate in more of those conversations, then perhaps the door can be opened to more women that represent an even a greater diversity of voices.
Yeah, I would echo what Anna and Lisa have said about mentoring, the role of women-only support groups, and being deliberate about mentoring women, both women that are currently in the positions, and then also seeking to provide more ladders into those positions. So women lifting up other women, but also, Anna, to your point about being more accessible, I think that that's really an important role. And as I think about, higher education and lots of different leadership roles within the Catholic Church, we need to do better about embracing more voices with different perspectives that might bring greater change. And because those voices are really valuable. And reflect the church as well and the growing different dynamics within the church. I also think that, we sometimes forget, but asking women what they need, how can they contribute, inviting them into contributing roles, but also insisting on that. So, as I look at, boards or the vice president's cabinet level positions, how many women, people of color, how many people are on there? Are we doing a good job of lifting up, making sure that those that are in leadership positions really reflect our communities, our colleges, our universities, our church, our parishes? Is that representation there? And if not, why? And really looking at that, particularly as white people. I think it's the burden on us to do some work around that too. But I think, there's certainly lots of movement forward, but we have a lot more work to do as well.
Thank you. Those are all such insightful comments on the future. And I think one more question for me before we go into our Q&A portion. And again, on this idea of moving forward, wasn't until we started tonight that it dawned with me that you all also work with young people within the church. So would love to hear your thoughts on their perceptions of, I guess, the future looking, for the next generation, their perceptions of potentially going into church work, or even the role of what, from young girls, of what they can play in the church moving forward.
Well, I know the Gen Zers that I work with are many more questions and about theology and dogma, but really service oriented. They are social justice fighters. They know more in their teenage years than I do as a full-fledged middle-aged woman about what is needed in our country and in our world. And I think that's exciting. I think it's, again, I keep saying hope, but I think it's very hopeful. They question a lot, and that's great because you learn and grow by questioning. But they are on fire for social justice, and they see a way forward to make change. They're not just angry about how things are. They've got thoughts on how to make change, and I think it's great.
So we've been holding synod listening sessions in Seattle, particularly with young people as well. So really diving into gathering a lot of this. And it's an interesting thing to, it's a beautiful thing to sit and listen. And we did an intensive listening process a few years ago as well around this. And you often hear what are the biggest challenges with the church, because I tend to work with young adults who we refer to as threshold Catholics. So they're like on their way out the door. A lot of the challenges that get raised are around women and are around LGBTQ inclusion in the church. But rather than those being specific areas of concern, which they are, but they name them as an example of the bigger challenge that is at play, which is the spaces in which the church is not living out the gospel message. They're like, we read the gospels, we see what Jesus did, we see who Jesus walked with, and then we look at some of the churches and we don't see it happening. So to Lisa's point around like social justice, they're like, where the social justice is not coming through is becoming so relevant. And here are two clear-cut examples that they name within that. And so it's an interesting conversation because there is an element of, some women wanting access to the priesthood or the deacons. And a lot of the young women I speak with, they say, I don't want to be a part of that hierarchy. The hierarchy is broken. I know I'm being recorded, but like there are pieces of the hierarchy that are broken and aren't necessarily working right. And so it's like more about how do we shift the system to be more inclusive and justice oriented within that as they move. And so there are some incredible young adults who I work with who are just like on fire for helping think about how do we change the system in a structural way that can help the gospel message like breathe through more freely.
And they're here wanting to make changes from the inside. They're not washing their hands of the Catholic Church and saying, I'm done, it's too broken. They're in the Catholic Church they're talking to you with their fire about how we can make changes. So that's a really great thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about a lot of young people wanting to make change, wanting to see change, wanting to be involved in that. I also, when I think about the colleges and universities that I look at, that I work with, we have maybe 20 to 40% of our students identifying as Catholic. So we can have another conversation about what that looks like, what that means. Um, self-identification. They might have grown up in the Catholic Church, but no longer identify that way. Or what we're finding is that, on many of our colleges campuses is that we have very diverse student populations. So campuses that have large Somali and Hmong populations or Latina populations. And what does that mean, about interfaith work as well? So, how does a Catholic institution support Muslim students? And I think students of this generation are very adept at and want to be involved in interfaith work, want to learn about each other and their religious beliefs, and that allows them to grow deeper in their own religious understandings as well as develop relationships and building bridges across the understanding of another person's religious background and understanding. So I think that's an important dynamic that I see happening at many of our campuses about both how do we include others into this work, and also how do we bring Catholic intellectual tradition? How do we bring the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph to students that have very little exposure to that prior to coming to campus? So what does that mean? Whether you're a Catholic or a non-Catholic or a nun not identifying, what does that mean for you as a student on one of our campuses?
Thank you. I think it's interesting because I think in our parish, we talk about that as well, as how do we bring more young people in? And it's something that we've discussed as well, as like they're so focused on social justice, and the church has such a rich tradition of social justice. How do we bring those two together? So definitely food for thought as we move forward.
And sorry, can I just add one more thing that I thought of? One of the important things that I think my directors of campus ministry and mission officers often say is there's nothing like service, or social justice to bring students into this work too. So we find that is often a vehicle for learning about your own community or going and visiting another community across the country or across town or maybe international work. But that community engagement often is a way of bringing people in that are excited about doing that work into deeper conversations about their faith and spirituality, and also their role within the church too.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. So I think with that, I would like to open it up to the rest of the group to see if there are any questions for our panelists. Patrick, I will start with you. Raise your hand.
Hi all. I don't know if my audio is coming through. I apologize. I'm in a library. Thank you all. So wonderful to hear these different perspectives. Martha, I had a question for you specifically as someone really interested in education and Catholic education. I'm a proud graduate of St. John's and St. Ben's in Minnesota. I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on continued questions and challenges of undergraduate enrollment, particularly at liberal arts colleges, and how you see that moving forward into kind of some uncharted waters now post-COVID.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of my former bosses is the new president at St. Ben's and St. John's. So that's exciting. So Dr. Brees is a great friend of mine. But I think enrollment management is critical. I mean, we see this across higher education in general, that numbers of young people are dropping, particularly in some regions. In the Northeast in particular has been dealing with issue. And because of that, we have many campuses, that are on a smaller scale that are no longer with us. They're closing their doors. So I think within higher education, we've had to think differently about how do we attract students? How do we enroll students? I think sometimes we think this is a new phenomenon too, and it isn't necessarily. I mean, we went through this, 30, 40 years ago, where a lot of campuses started talking about non-traditional students. So moving more programming towards adult education. What does that look like? Now we've seen in recent years about online education. What does that look like? We don't know. I don't know with post-COVID if there was more of a palette for that or less of a palette for online education, but certainly our students are talking more about, we want more courses online. We might not want it all online. And we are also seeing this dynamic of students that want to live on campus. They want that residential campus environment, but they want to take their classes totally remote or online. So they're living on campus, they're eating in the cafeteria, but they're taking their classes online because it's flexible. There's lots of different reasons for it. So I think in terms of enrollment, we need to think critically about how do we meet the needs of our students? What are they looking for? What do they want? And how many students are there too? And being flexible with creating some different models for our work. So one of the things that we recently launched was an online course sharing consortium where students can take courses at any of our campuses online, we've got 8 out of our 9 members involved in that. So, and they can take courses across campuses, or we have a student exchange program. So thinking about where are students at in terms of what are they looking for their college education, and making sure that our campuses are nimble and flexible enough to meet those needs, but also in a way that we're not, driving up costs where we're running our institutions into the ground, because sadly that is the case on many of our campuses. Smaller campuses are really struggling right now. And if I think about 10 years from now, I don't know if I'll have 9-member campuses, quite honestly. And I think most consortium leaders, whether you're in religious leadership with charism groups, or if I think about some of my other colleagues in other areas, the small campuses will be out of business in a few years, struggling to meet the needs. So I don't know if that answered fully your question, but I think it's very challenging time, but an exciting time, right? For innovation and rethinking about how higher education can really move us into the next decades.
Thank you, Martha. And I see you have a question as well.
Do you mean me?
Yes, sir. Catherine Wolf.
Okay, all right, there you go. My name is Catherine Wolf, and I'm from St. Francis Xavier Parish down on West 16th Street in New York. I think my question goes mostly to Anna and Lisa. Over the years, in observing women's roles with male clergy, I think I've discerned that they're very happy to have women facing outwards to the community in a variety of roles. They are not so comfortable with women facing inwards within their own community and especially the hierarchy. And the groups that are, or the priests who are, 60 and over, seem far more comfortable with women than the younger priests in their 30s and 40s, who are far more rigid and rely more on the accoutrements of clericalism. Do you have any thoughts to express in those lines, especially as we're talking about how we're going to attract young women who are in their 30s and 40s? I'm done.
Want to go first?
Okay, sure. Well, unfortunately, Catherine, you are not wrong. It was a little eye-opening, I won't lie, when the younger crop of priests came up and they were far more rigid than some of their older counterparts. It was hard for me to understand for a while, but I will say my current boss is young, and maybe it took him a while, but I think he saw the value in the voice of women. So you are absolutely right. And, I started in my local parish as a worker bee doing whatever anybody needed to be done. But I think the longer I was around, the more my voice was valued and my opinion and my thoughts on things. So I don't know that I have a great answer for you, except, to stay the course, because we can all set up chairs and help in the parish hall and all of that, but our voices matter, and so we need to stay and share them. That's really all I can say, but I will agree. I was shocked when our younger priests were so rigid in their thinking.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Catherine. I noticed we both were smiling as you asked it. I listened to a talk recently on Mary Magdalene, and it talked about how in the early images of Christ on the cross, she's right at the foot of the cross, which we know from our Gospels, right? That's where she was. And it showed the progression of Mary Magdalene across the centuries as people continued to depict what it looked like at the cross. And she gets further and further and further away from the foot of the cross, and then eventually is out of the picture entirely. And I think that there is an element that you named of like that scarcity mindset of feeling like I need to be at the right and left hand, right? That there is an element of that there's a certain space of that. And so how do I combat that, or how do I approach that, tends to be when I enter into a space of scarcity where it feels like there might not be enough, is thinking, how do I introduce abundance? How do I introduce the idea that God's love is much bigger than anything that we could be trying to put into a box around it? And I find that by flipping the narrative a bit, to as much as I can in those spaces, to say like, how do we show up in an attitude of abundance and an attitude of just like asking a question or changing the conversation, that it kind of takes some of the people who might ask me to leave the room off guard a little bit, and then they're like, wait a second, and their curiosity gets piqued. And so it's kind of a question for me of like, whose game am I playing? And how do I show up in those spaces with an attitude of trying to be as creatively Christ-like as possible as we go. And so to your question about like, how do we include younger people? I think there is a deep desire for creativity where they say the old ways don't work anymore. And so how do we show up with a new creativity and a new sense of abundance into these spaces? Does that mean that there are days that I feel hopeless? Yes, there are definitely days that I still am like banging my head against the wall. But there are also days where there's like, I think just new opportunities for the Spirit to like blow through with, fire and wind and bring in new opportunities.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we'll wrap up for the evening.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm Stephanie Malinsky. My question is, when each of you talked about your roles, it sounds like you guys are dealing with a lot of change and you're working at an intersection of something that's constantly evolving. But when I think about the church, I think about a lot of tradition and how it's rooted in tradition and has been for centuries. How do you navigate that? And do you find that the church is receptive to you bringing in what you need to navigate the change in your role?
You
That's
clearly
wrong.
stumped us all. No, it's a really good question. It's a really great question. I think for me, I have found that Kara recently put out a report. That's the Center for Applied Research, something else. Sorry, I've forgotten my acronym. But they talked about young people's involvement in the church coming out of COVID, or in this current space of COVID that we're still in. And they talked about that there is this deep return to a sense of small Christian communities. And so when the conversation about tradition comes up, I like to point people towards like the oldest tradition of like, what were the early Christian communities like? It was small Christian communities of people who were just trying to live out the faith and share everything they had in common, and live in a sense of sustainability and abundance, and sharing with each other, and pulling it back that way. So there's definitely challenges that we face with a sense of tradition. And then the question that I just always like to pose is like, how deep of a tradition are we willing to dive into? Are we willing to go back to the time of Jesus, like the Gospels that we root ourselves after? And can we root ourselves back there? That's for me, I think.
And yes, it is definitely a time of change and needed change. But I think the Bible, the Great Commission calls us to go make disciples. And it didn't say, that's all it said, go make disciples. And so we can do that without touching or harming our beautiful tradition and our beautiful liturgies, and obviously without damaging the Mass or the Eucharist. But Jesus told us to make disciples. And so that's really what we have to focus on. So does change need to be, is change needed? Yes. Through the ages, people change and ideas change and ways change. And Jesus didn't say make disciples this way, do this, this, and this. Jesus said make disciples. So I'm not advocating we get rid of our tradition or our liturgy or our beautiful masses, but we definitely have to make change in order to follow the one great commission we were given.
I think that's a great question. I come at it a little bit from when I think back to where the Sisters of St. Joseph were founded in Le Puy, France in 1650. They were uncloistered. They were women that were making a difference in their community. They were spiritual women grounding themselves in who they were, but they were also meeting the needs around them. And they were very focused on that, about how they can meet the community, meet the needs of the time. So when I thought about your question, I thought also one thing that we talk a lot about within the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph is how are we growing and changing to meet the needs of the time? And what does that look like now? And being flexible and being responsive to that is really important. So yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you, guys.
Colleen, before you leave, I'm going to put in the chat the name of a relatively recent book called The Defiant Middle. And it talks about how many women saints, in order to be understood, had to be sanitized to make them acceptable to the church at large. It was reviewed, I think, in Commonweal, but I'm going to put the name and the author in the chat, because I think we have to be more confrontational. I mean, we were just talking about Mary Magdalene. The Cardinal of New York had no qualms about further besmirching her reputation in a Wall Street Journal column earlier this year. And, enough said.
Thank you,
I can-
Kathy. Yes, I
I can
think
get the chat to work. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it right now.
I have not read that. book, but I think it's a great opportunity for our parish. And we have a parish book club, so maybe that's one that we can do moving forward as we continue to reflect on the role of women and the role of women traditionally. I think I think that was a great question to Stephanie of what is tradition and what is tradition? What does tradition mean? And I think the stories have changed, right? Or the stories can be told in a certain way. And as we look back through our church history, we have many examples of great women. And even though it's what we're today in terms of lay women in certain roles, lay women have always been part of the church and have always probably wielded more power than we may have recognized or they have been given credit for. So with that, I think we will, we're just over an hour, so we'll wrap up for the evening, but I want to thank everyone who joined us, both our panelists as well as those of you who joined us, both from St. Francis de Sales and from other communities. It was, I think, a really good discussion. It was wonderful to hear everybody, all three of your points of view. It certainly gives me a lot of hope moving forward as we continue to think about the role of women in the church, and when it can be discouraging at times. And then this will be posted on our website for St. Francis de Sales, or website, YouTube, what the standard is. So if you know of anyone who you think would enjoy this discussion but wasn't able to make it tonight, we'll have that available for them to watch.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Colleen, and for being here. I was thinking one of the things that can help us with moving forward in the church is acknowledging the work that women do. And so, Colleen, I know you did a ton of work to pull this together, and it was an honor to sit on this panel. So thank you, and big props.
It was a joy. Thank you for having us.
Great.
Good night, everybody.